Well, good morning, everybody. Hey, I don't know if you know this about me, but my claim to fame in high school, besides the fact that I was captain of the math team, which drove the girls wild, by the way. Besides the fact that also I went to my senior prom all goth. You know, I had like lipstick on, I had a black leather jacket with handcuffs on one side and chains on the other side. I actually showed a picture of that a couple years ago and everybody was really disturbed by that, so I'm not gonna show that again. But, okay, so my claim to fame in high school was actually the fact that I was actually the best musician at my school. It sounds like somebody actually laughed back there. Sounds like you guys aren't very impressed by that. Let me say that one more time. My claim to fame in high school was actually the fact that I was the best musician at my school. Come on, people. Stop. Because when you grow up in an Asian household, I don't know if you know this, there's tons of freedom in an Asian household. You're either allowed to choose to play the violin or the piano. And if you're a real rebel, then maybe you're going to choose like the viola or something. But I got the senior music award at my high school. I was on a first name basis with my high school music teacher. And so this is what I thought. I thought that 4 years later, after I graduated, that I'd go back and grace my high school with my presence, because obviously everybody would remember who the senior music award winner from 4 years ago was, just like I remember who the Super Bowl winner was 4 years ago. It was probably the Patriots, but who knows? Okay, yes. This is going south quick. So I show up at my school 4 years later, I barge into my music teacher's classroom, I'm like, Ted, it's me, Ted. And you know what he said? He said this: I don't know who you are, but get out of my classroom. So here's a quick question that we want to ask this morning, and that's this question right here. Have you ever thought you were more important than you actually were? Someone say yes. Okay, have you ever been in a relationship? Have you ever been at a church? Have you ever been in a job where you felt a little bit unappreciated? So you thought that what you were going to do is do a preemptive strike. You're going to break up. You're going to go your own way, thinking that that life would not be able to go on without you, only to realize that the other side almost moved on quicker than you did. I have some senior pastor friends who have just recently retired, and they're the ones who planted their church. They're the ones who helped grow their church to thousands of people. And, everybody's like, Pastor, we love you so much. Pastor, we'd never be able to get along without you. But then the moment the new guy came, everyone was like, Pastor who? And the senior pastor had talked about how things almost very eerily got along extremely quickly without them. If you want to see how irreplaceable you are in life, here's a little exercise that you can do. You ready for it? Place your hand in a bucket of water. Remove that hand as quickly as you can. And the amount of time that it takes the water to get back to normal is the amount of time that it takes life to go on without you. And so here's one of the things that we want to talk about today in Romans chapter 12, and that is, what we want to do is we want to talk about this element of pride. Here's a working definition of pride, and that's this definition right here. Pride is thinking of myself higher than I ought. Why do you wear the clothes that you do? Why do you drive the car that you do? Why do you post on Facebook the way that you do? Why do you want the kind of house that you do? Why do you get all up in arms and really sensitive when your wife tells you that you shouldn't be sitting on the couch watching Netflix all day when you should be engaging with your children? Not that I have ever been told any of those things. Why do we get so sensitive in a situation like this? Why? Because we think we have a tendency to think of ourselves pretty highly. And left unchecked, the natural tendency of all of that then is to think of ourselves more highly than we ought. And so here we are. What we're doing during the summer is we're covering all of Romans chapter 12. And what you're going to find is that Romans chapter 1 through 11 is probably the Apostle Paul's greatest presentation, the greatest treatise on the message of Christianity that us Christians like to call the gospel. And what he wants to do in chapters 1 through 11 is he wants to talk about how it is that the guilty are to become innocent before a holy God. How are we to become innocent before a holy God? And it's not because of the evidence, and it's not because we're actually innocent, but actually because Christ came to this earth to die on a cross to acquit us of all of our sins and to acquit us of all of our charges. Now, by the time we get to Romans chapter 12 is all about this. It's all about how are the guilty then to live? How are the acquitted to go on with their life? Are they to go on living like the guilty? In Romans chapter 6, the Apostle Paul would say, heck no. And so that's what we want to talk about. Romans chapter 12, if you have your Bibles, Romans chapter 12, we talked about verse 1, we've talked about verse 2. Today I have the privilege of talking about verse 3. Would y'all stand with me, whether you're here, whether you're in the cafe? Would y'all stand with me in the honor of the reading of God's word this morning? Romans chapter 12, verse 3 says this right here. For by the grace given to me, so again, he's referring back to what it is that he talked about in Romans chapter 1, verse 11, the grace of God that has been extended unto him. So in light of the grace that has been given unto me, this is what I would say unto you. Do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with, would y'all say that phrase with me, with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. That we are to not think of ourselves more highly than we ought, but that we are to think of ourselves with sober judgment. Before you sit down, would you turn to somebody and would you say, you ain't all that? Girl, you ain't all that. Okay, so let me catch you up, if you've missed the past couple weeks, on where we are in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. Romans chapter 12, verse 1, he says this, that you are, in light of everything that Christ has done for you, and in light of the fact that God has sacrificed himself for you, what are you to do? Are you to do absolutely nothing? No. That just as Christ has sacrificed himself for you, now it's your turn to sacrifice yourself for him. And not a dead sacrifice, because all sacrifices are dead, but a living sacrifice, a sacrifice that places ourselves on the altar every single day, committing ourselves to God. He then goes on to say, don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So in other words, your relationship with God should not only affect your external behavior, but first of all, it needs to affect your internal character. And then as we get to verse 3, he talks about the first place, the first change that we are to see in that internal character. And he says this, that the first change that I want to see is this, that you would simply not think of yourselves more highly than you ought. You and I would go, okay, well, God wants, I've just given my life to Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. What's going to be the evidence of that change? Well, I need to go to church every week. And that's a great behavior, but it's still an external behavior. Can you go to church every week and still not be a Christian? The answer is yes. You and I might say, that the answer to me being a Christian and evidencing that in my life is that I need to be on a set up and tear down team, which I would not fight you on, by the way. But it's still an external behavior. He says that what comes before the external behavior is an internal character change. And the first evidence of your relationship with God is simply that you would be a humble person. That you would not think of yourself more highly than you ought. And what you're going to find is that is very, very, very different than the world that we live in. Because the world is constantly telling you that you need to think of yourself more highly. That you need to respect yourself. That you need to treat yourself. That you need to esteem yourself that you need to look in a mirror and you need to say that I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. Let me tell you this. Whenever a child misbehaves, whenever a person does drugs, whenever a woman mistreats her body, whenever a person commits a crime, the answer that we have a tendency to come to in our culture and in our civilization, in our time right now, is obviously that person didn't think of themselves highly enough. That person didn't have a positive self-image of themselves, which is part of the reason why we give every child a soccer trophy, because we would obviously torture that child unless we gave them something that they didn't deserve. Right? But here's what you have to understand, that up until the 20th century, no culture, no civilization ever thought that. Up until the past 100 years, most cultures and most civilizations thought the problem of that culture, that the problem of people really lied within the fact that people actually think too highly of themselves. The people actually esteem themselves too much. And I really think that part of the attractiveness of this low self-esteem theory, this low self-esteem idea that we believe today, is because if we believe that the answer is that low self-esteem, well, then we don't have to make any moral judgments about somebody's behavior, do we? See, there used to be a day where we could challenge somebody's behavior and we could call it bad. We can't call anybody a bad person anymore. Man, I miss those days. The only thing that you can do is pat little Hitler on the back and tell him to turn that frown upside down. Because if you do that, well, then all of a sudden we don't have to wade into the moral ambiguity that our culture loves to live in, do we? Here's part of the reason why the Apostle Paul addresses pride. What you have to understand is that part of the reason why he addresses pride is not simply because, he wants you to be down on yourself. The Bible wants you to think this about pride, and this is what the Bible purports and proposes about pride, and that is this principle right here, that pride, believe it or not, is actually the worst of all sins. So what's worse than rape? Evidently, it's pride. What's worse than murder? Evidently, it's pride. What's worse than buying a TV from Costco and then returning it the day after the Super Bowl? Evidently, it's pride. Martin Luther, if you don't know who Martin Luther is, he's just like a really smart Christian. He says this about pride right here, that pride is the head, the life, and the very nature of all of sin. In other words, that's not a part of the quote. That's what I'm supposed to say right there. Okay. So, in other words, what you're going to find is that pride isn't actually the worst of all sins in its consequence, that pride is not the worst of all sins in terms of what it is that's going to happen after it, that pride is the worst of all sins because pride is the battery source of sin. Pride is the head of sin. It is the life source of sin. It is the fuel of sin. What you will find is that every sin, including Satan's fall from heaven, by the way, that every sin that has ever been committed in the history of the world, guess where it started with? It started with pride. It started with this idea that, you know what, that I deserve more. I deserve to be spoken to better than that. I deserve better than what I'm receiving right now. You know, we don't use that word pride in our modern day language very much. You know what we use? We use a similar word, and it's called entitlement. That person is so entitled. Anybody know anybody that's entitled? Okay, let me put it like this. Anybody have a teenager? Okay. Pride is this idea where I think I deserve something. I think I have the right to something that I really don't. at the end of the day. Here's what you have to understand about pride, that pride is not only thinking of myself higher than I ought to, pride is also thinking of myself, believe it or not, lower than I ought to. Because you, at some point in your life, have done something like this in order to gain attention, right? I'm just not very good. I'm just not a very good speaker. I'm just not a very good employee. I'm just not a good mom. I'm just not a good teacher. How many of you have ever seen a Facebook post like this? Somebody posts on Facebook, I'm just not very beautiful. And then what happens after that? There's the flood of comments that comes, right? Girl, you're so beautiful. Girl, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever met. Girl, you're beautiful inside and out. Here's what I want you to understand, that an inferiority complex and a superiority complex are really the same thing. Do you know why? Because they both seek to make the conversation all about me. That I need you to esteem me. That I need you to value me. That I need you to respect me. One time I had an opportunity to meet with a whole bunch of pastors, and we're going to meet with this big church pastor who's not only so strategic and so visionary in so many ways, but just a great guy. So we were all sitting around in a circle, all of us pastors, when, this senior pastor, Larry Osborne, comes in. For those of you who know Larry, fantastic guy, maybe you've read some of his book. Larry walks into the room. He wants all of us to go ahead and introduce ourselves. And all of us go ahead and introduce ourselves by our first name. I mean, with the exception of Dr. Insecurity. Now, Dr. Insecurity, probably didn't know that most of the people in the room had a doctorate to begin with. Or maybe he just didn't have a first name like the rest of us peons. I'm not too sure. But that's where much of pride even comes from, doesn't it? Here's a quick point that I want to make, and that's this right here. Everybody thinks they're a servant until they're talked to like one. Right? Here's another quote from C.S. Lewis right here. C.S. Lewis says this right here. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next person. I want you to process, and I want you to think about that for a second. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having something more of it than the next person. In other words, you know what you really want at the end of the day? You just want a bigger In other words, that you really don't want to be rich, you just want to be rich. Because in fact, how do you even know that you're rich unless you have somebody to compare yourself to? See, you don't want a nice car. You just want one that's nice. Say it with me. You don't want a big house. You just want one that's big. You don't want to just be smart. You want to be smart. You want to be pretty. You want to be tall. You want to be big. You want to be successful. And sometimes what happens, right, is that you look in the mirror and you hate you because you realize that you'll never be as them. And see, it's in that situation that how do we begin to deal with that pride? How do we deal with that insecurity? How do we deal with that awful feeling that we'll never be able to measure up? I love what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3. He says this right here. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, he says, by the way, I think this is an absolute game changer. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3, it says this right here. I care very little if I am judged by you or any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself. So what the Apostle Paul is saying is this, that part of the reason why I don't clean up my house before house guests come over, how many of you would love to do something like that? The reason why I don't clean up before house guests come over, that the reason why I wear wingtips with my Bermuda shorts, the reason why I sing karaoke at the top of my lungs. The Apostle Paul says, is because I could care less what other people think about me. How many of you would love to be in a state like that? That's me. I would love to not care about what other people think about me. Now, all of a sudden, what you find is that you and I would expect the Apostle Paul in this moment then to say, you know what? The only thing I care about is what I think of myself. Yet what you're going to find is that the Apostle Paul does not go there, does he? The Apostle Paul then goes on to say this, that he doesn't care about what any human court thinks about him. He says this, I do not even judge myself. That in other words, he's saying this, that I don't have a very high opinion of what you think of me. Guess what? I don't even have a very high opinion of what I think of me. You know why? Because I don't get my self-worth from other people's opinions, nor do I get my self-worth and my validation even from what I think about myself. Because I don't know how you think of yourself, but I have a voice in my head that's very, very, very not nice to me. He goes on to say this. What the Apostle Paul is going to do then is he's going to move right off the map into a territory that you and I know nothing about. And he says this in verse 4, where he says this right here, that my conscience is clear, but that doesn't make me innocent. Boy, would I love to do a sermon just on that verse. That just because you don't think you're doing anything wrong doesn't mean that you're not doing anything wrong, is essentially what the Apostle Paul is saying. But even more importantly, Mark, let's stay on topic, let's stay on topic, let's stay on topic. It is the Lord who judges me. Okay, this is crazy what the Apostle Paul is saying here. Because he says, yeah, I don't think of myself higher than I ought. I also don't think of myself lower than I ought. I just don't think of myself at all. C.S. Lewis, in probably his greatest work called Mere Christianity, he says this. He says that when you meet a humble person, that you would never come away going, wow, humble person, humble pig over there. Like, whoa, that person was totally humble. He said you wouldn't do that. He said that if you were to come away from meeting a humble person, what you would think is this, wow, that person just seemed really, really, really interested in me. Was always wanting to turn the spotlight away from themselves, the conversation away from themselves, always wanting to put the conversation back on me, the focus on me. In other words, humility isn't about thinking more of myself. Humility isn't about thinking less of myself. Humility is simply about thinking of myself less. You know what, Tim Keller, there's a pastor named Tim Keller. He calls this right here. He calls this the blessing of self-forgetfulness. The blessing of self-forgetfulness. See, let me ask you this. Are you ever hurt by criticism? Are you ever hurt when your wife, your husband, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your mother, your father come to you and lend some very helpful advice about how it is that you are to live your life? Are you open to the idea of your boss coming into your office and telling you how it is that you might be able to improve your work performance? Because here's the thing. A truly humble person isn't devastated by criticism. Do you know why? Because other people's opinions, what other people think of them, aren't truly, truly, truly that important to them. Here's what I think. This is what I believe. One of the best bands in the era of modern music, I think, is U2. And part of the reason why I believe that is not only because they've sold 170 million records and because they've earned 22 22 different Grammys. And if you look at the All-Star Hall of Fame Grammy list, what you're going to find is that they're really, I would say, amongst the top 10 or top 20, the only band and not solo artist. 22 Grammys, and this is what Bono has to say about his band and his life. He says this right here. There are moments when people, referring to his band members, there are moments when band members are so lost in their own selves, so lost in the demands of their own life, that it's very, very hard to be in a band. People want control. People want credit. People want to be the lords of their own domain. And then he says this, I mean, everybody as they get older begins to rid the room of argument. You see this in your family. You see this in your friends. I would add that you see this in your workplace with your boss. That what ultimately ends up happening is that their group of people around them get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until they ultimately end up with only a group of people who will agree with them. And then he comments at the end by saying this right here, that life ends up with a very, very dull sweetness. Are people afraid to tell you things? Are people stepping on eggshells as they walk around you? Because what you will find is that very, very few bands stay together. Jay-Z used to be in a band. Justin Timberlake used to be in a band. Ice Cube used to be in a band. Beyonce used to be in a band before they thought, I don't know if I want to share the limelight all that much. You know, very few sports teams end up staying together. Can I ask you this? You think if Shaq and Kobe stayed together that they might have won a couple more championships together? Yeah, like I think so. And you know, because of that very same reason, very few marriages end up staying together as well. Pride, 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 pride. Let's go back to verse 4 because verse 4 says this, that my conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent because it is the Lord who judges me. I want you to look at that word innocent, and I want you to look at that word judges, because what you will find is that the Apostle Paul is using legal language, isn't he? When you talk about innocence, what are you talking about? He's talking about a verdict at the end of the day. And what he's saying is this, what you ultimately want in life, and what I ultimately want in life, is this ultimate verdict that is pronounced over me, that I am valuable, that I am important, that I am successful, that I am a good mom. And so what will we do as people? You know what we will do? We will, every day, you will drag yourself into the courtroom. Every single day, you will drag yourself back onto trial. Here's the problem with that one idea, that some days you do good, but most days you're doing really, really, really bad, if you're anything like me. And what you will find is this. The Apostle Paul says, you know that roller coaster ride of your own self-identity that you find yourself on? He says this, I've found the solution to that. I've found the answer to that. That my trial is over. And my verdict is in. Because what does he say? He says this right here. Because it is the Lord who judges me. That in other words, that I don't care what y'all think about me. Guess what? I don't even care what I think about myself. That the only opinion that matters to me is what God thinks about me at the end of the day. Let me give you an example. Guess how I feel on Sunday after I give a bad sermon? I feel awful. Let me ask you this. Guess how I feel after I give a good sermon on Sunday? I feel even worse. You know why? Because I leave on Sunday thinking like this, I was so good. You can tell I struggle with a low self-image of myself. I was so good. I was so funny. This sounds so prideful. But then here's my thought, but I could never do that again. I just can't. And so maybe you can relate with this. I leave on Sunday thinking I'm somebody, but then on Monday morning, I go back to being a nobody who's trying to prove again that I'm a somebody. And guess what? It's exhausting. And it's tiring. And here's my goal one day. That one day that I would be able to give a darn about what y'all thought about me. That I would give a darn about what I thought about myself. And that I would say that my verdict isn't based upon my next sermon, because my verdict is already in. For some of you, what you're going to find is this. For some of you who are mommies, for some of you who are stay-at-home daddies, this is what you're thinking to yourself, that my value and that my worth in life comes from how patient I'm going to be with my child tomorrow, and how it is that I'm going to treat my child tomorrow, and whether or not I'm going to yell or be patient with them tomorrow. And God says that's not the case, because your value and your verdict is already in. For some of you who live on this constant treadmill of trying to do sales in your life, you're going, that my worth and my value is very evident as I see this list of who it is that's the top salesperson, and that's not me. So my worth then is based upon how much I sell tomorrow and how much I sell next quarter, and God says that ain't the case, because your verdict is already in. Students, you want to take your value from how it is that you do on the SATs, or whether you make varsity or not, or what kind of college that you go to, and God says, you know what, that's not the case at all. Because you know what I love about Christianity? And you know what I love about our relationship with God? It's the fact that it's the only place in the world where the verdict actually comes before the evidence. That the verdict actually leads us to the evidence. See, in any other place, what you're going to find is this, that even an atheist, let's say, wants to be considered a good person, so what do? The evidence has to lead to the verdict. So they live with this weight and they live with this burden of trying to live a good life in order to define themselves as a good person. It is the evidence that leads them to the verdict, but your relationship with God and my relationship with God is the only place where the verdict comes first. And the verdict then leads me to my evidence. The verdict being that I am loved. The verdict being that I am valued. And that I am so valuable that God would send his son to die on a cross for me. That is my value. All of a sudden, I do the things that I do not because I have to, but I do the things that I do simply out of the joy of doing them. I go to church simply for the joy of going to church. That I read my Bible, that I volunteer, that I pray, that I do whatever that I give, that I do whatever I do for the sheer joy of doing what I do. So that's the beauty of that. And I would love for even some of you to place your faith in Jesus Christ today, to be able to say, God, for too long, I have placed my worth on my job. For too long, I have placed my worth in my children. For too long, I've placed my worth in how many likes and comments I get on Facebook. Here's what I'm going to do, God. Yours is the only opinion that matters to me. Why don't you bow your heads and pray with me? Father God.